The brain is a reward-seeking machine, and one of the most powerful chemicals that drives motivation, effort, and focus is dopamine. In a culture overloaded with instant gratification, the ability to delay that reward becomes a superpower, especially in 2025, where distractions are no longer occasional, but embedded into every device, platform, and interaction. When you work hard in silence, you're not just staying disciplined, you're fundamentally retraining your dopamine circuitry for long-term resilience and internal satisfaction. Dopamine is not only released when we achieve a goal, it's primarily released in pursuit of a goal. This is where most people misunderstand motivation. They think it comes after progress. But neurobiologically, motivation is manufactured while you're in the grind, when you're pushing through resistance, stacking quiet effort, and not telling a soul what you're up to. Every time you do a task that aligns with your vision, whether it's coding for 30 minutes, running at 5 a.m., studying after work, you release a small but powerful pulse of dopamine. And over time, your brain starts to associate the process, not the result, with pleasure. That rewires your baseline motivation. The key is this: the location of your dopamine matters. If you attach dopamine to praise, likes, or external recognition, your effort becomes dependent on things you can't control. But if you associate it with the action itself, the writing, the lifting, the learning, your drive becomes self-sustaining. Working in silence gives you the space to re-engineer where your brain places that dopamine. You start to crave the session, the set, the practice, not the performance. That's the biological basis of becoming unstoppable. In silence, there is no applause, no feedback, no attention. And while that might feel discouraging to some, it's actually the perfect neurological training ground. Without the noise of validation, your brain is forced to recalibrate its reward systems. This builds a tolerance for discomfort and a hunger for process. It's in this silent chamber of effort where the deepest wiring changes happen. The absence of recognition becomes a neurological advantage because it forces your brain to build its own internal reward map. In 2025, where algorithms hijack your attention and reward you for simply announcing plans or pretending progress, the ability to stay quiet and delay gratification becomes rare and extremely powerful. Imagine two people. One announces every new venture, every minor achievement, and gets a flood of validation. The other keeps building, refining, struggling, without ever posting about it. 6 months later, the first person is addicted to applause and empty gestures, while the second has sharpened their skill set, thickened their focus, and become neurologically resilient. That is the compounding power of silent work on the dopamine system. There's also the biological impact of dopamine balance. Every time you spike dopamine through cheap rewards, scrolling, bragging, or chasing attention, you create a crash, your baseline dips, your motivation wanes. But when you earn dopamine through effort, through long sessions without interruption, you stabilize that baseline. You become less reactive, less addicted to novelty, and more grounded in deep work. This isn't just psychological, it's biochemical. Working hard in silence gives your brain room to build a new operating system. It teaches the nervous system that true reward lives in self-discipline, not social performance. It teaches the frontal cortex to dominate over the limbic system. It teaches you that the absence of noise is not a void, but a forge. You're not depriving yourself of recognition. You're developing the ability to manufacture motivation on demand. You're taking control of your inner neurochemistry and redirecting it toward high-value behavior. The more you delay the reward, the more you strengthen the system. The more silent your grind, the more potent your transformation. You're creating a brain that seeks challenge over comfort, consistency over applause, and depth over speed. The act of working in silence becomes a neurobiological advantage. You're not just grinding, you're shaping your future dopamine circuitry to crave what matters and ignore what doesn't. And once that's locked in, your output no longer depends on hype or momentum. It runs on internal fuel. It runs on design, not desire. It runs on brain chemistry you earn through quiet repetition, not public performance. The human brain is not designed to operate under constant noise, stimulation, or information overload. Yet in 2025, that is exactly the environment most people live in. Phones buzzing every few minutes, endless content feeds, social media updates, messages, and even artificial environments pushing notifications. All of this trains the brain to become reactive, fragmented, and overstimulated. And when the brain is overstimulated, the prefrontal cortex, the seat of focus, planning, decision-making becomes compromised. This is why high performers are not just defined by their work ethic, but also by their ability to control their environment. Working hard in silence isn't just a mindset. It's a biological strategy to protect and optimize the brain's limited attentional resources. In a low stimulation environment, the brain shifts from a reactive state to a responsive one. The difference is crucial. When you're reactive, your amygdala, the fear and urgency center of the brain, takes over. You're jumping from one thing to the next, driven by emotional impulses and external cues. But when you're in a controlled, silent space with minimal stimulation, your prefrontal cortex is activated. This part of the brain is responsible for long-term planning, deep thinking, and impulse control. It allows you to focus, to delay gratification, and to work on what matters, even when distractions are calling for your attention. Research shows that the brain can only handle a limited number of attentional shifts per day before mental fatigue sets in. Every time you check your phone, reply to a notification, or mentally switch tasks, your brain pays a cost. It's called attention residue, where part of your cognitive capacity remains stuck on the previous task even after you move on. In silence, you minimize those shifts. You create an uninterrupted space where your cognitive energy is conserved and directed with purpose. That's why some of the most effective people in the world build routines that include time blocks of complete silence, no distractions, no external engagement, just execution. The nervous system thrives on rhythm and regulation. Constant stimulation dysregulates your autonomic nervous system, keeping you in a low-level fight or flight state. Silent, focused work brings you back into a parasympathetic state where restoration, learning, and creativity take place. This is not just psychological, it's physiological. Your heart rate variability improves. Your cortisol levels stabilize. Your respiratory rate slows. You begin to operate from a space of calm intensity rather than scattered anxiety. You build the capacity to sustain deep effort without needing adrenaline or chaos to push you. Working hard in silence also changes how your brain encodes memory and skill. When you practice or execute a task in a low stimulation environment, your brain forms cleaner, more precise neural pathways. There's less interference from competing inputs, which means the information you're absorbing or the skill you're building gets encoded more deeply. This is crucial for long-term mastery. You're not just working, you're wiring excellence into your neural architecture. And there's a psychological element that complements the biology. In silence, your internal voice becomes louder. You begin to hear your own thoughts, your own intentions, your own direction. This is vital in 2025, where the default state is to be externally directed, consumed by the opinions, outputs, and expectations of others. When you withdraw from noise, you regain sovereignty over your focus. You're no longer just reacting to what the world throws at you. You're deliberately choosing what to build, where to place your energy, and how to shape your day. Silent effort becomes an act of self-authorship. Most people think they need more motivation, more hacks, more stimulation to push themselves forward. But what they really need is less noise, fewer distractions, reduced friction. They need an environment that aligns with the brain's natural design. Low stimulation environments are not about deprivation, they're about precision. They allow you to enter flow states more easily, where time compresses, distraction vanishes, and effort becomes effortless. That's where real breakthroughs happen, not in the rush of hype, but in the depth of stillness. The brain is like a lens. In a cluttered environment, that lens becomes dirty, blurry, and scattered. In a silent environment, it sharpens. You begin to see your goals more clearly. You start to access deeper levels of concentration. You move from shallow effort to meaningful progress. And in a world that's getting louder by the day, the person who masters silence holds the advantage. Silence is not the absence of activity. It's the amplification of focus. It's where quality effort is forged and where the brain reclaims its original strength, the ability to go deep, stay disciplined, and create something enduring without distraction. At the foundation of personal transformation, mastery, and long-term success lies a concept that has been widely studied in neuroscience: neuroplasticity. It is the brain's ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections throughout life. But what's often misunderstood is what actually drives this neuroplastic change. Many believe that breakthrough moments, recognition, or motivation from others are what spark growth. The truth is far more grounded. The brain changes through repetition, not by being seen or celebrated. And when you work hard in silence without expecting recognition, you create the ideal conditions for the brain to evolve. Each time you repeat a behavior, whether it's practicing a skill, running a routine, or solving a problem, you're firing the same neural circuits. With enough repetition, these circuits become more efficient, faster, and automatic. This is known as Hebbian learning, neurons that fire together, wire together. However, for this rewiring to occur in a way that supports lasting change, the effort must be consistent and focused, not interrupted by the pursuit of external validation. Recognition can feel good temporarily, but it does not create the conditions the brain needs to undergo structural transformation. The deep layers of neural remodeling happen when you're immersed in the work, not when you're rewarded for it. In fact, seeking recognition too early in the process can interfere with neuroplasticity. When you announce your goals, achievements, or progress, your brain gets a dopamine spike, a reward signal, without completing the behavior. This false reward can lead to decreased follow-through because the brain believes it has already received what it wanted. It no longer has the same chemical incentive to continue pushing forward. In contrast, silent, focused repetition keeps dopamine tightly linked to the behavior itself, ensuring the neuroplastic circuits responsible for discipline, attention, and persistence are reinforced. The silent grind allows the brain to prioritize the process. There are no distractions, no applause, no interruptions to the feedback loop between effort and internal reward. This feedback loop is essential for long-term adaptation. When you do something repeatedly in the same context, the brain marks it as important. Over time, it devotes more neural resources to that behavior, pruning away less used connections to make room. This is how skills become automatic. This is how habits take root, not by being acknowledged, but by being executed over and over, often in complete silence. This is especially relevant in 2025, where short attention spans and hyper-stimulation make repetition harder than ever. The brain is constantly pulled toward novelty, new content, new notifications, new distractions. But neuroplasticity doesn't respond to novelty. It responds to consistency. It doesn't care about how interesting or glamorous the work looks to others. It only cares about whether you're doing it again and again with focus and intent. The silence protects that consistency. It removes the temptation to shift gears or showcase half-finished work. It shields your effort from dilution. Working hard in silence also encourages deep practice, a state where repetition is combined with attention, reflection, and correction. This kind of practice produces the most potent neuroplastic change because it actively engages the brain's error detection and correction systems. When you're not performing for others, you're free to make mistakes and self-correct without fear of judgment or distraction. These micro adjustments in practice are what sharpen performance and deepen learning. In silence, you're not just repeating mindlessly, you're shaping every movement, every thought, every response with intention. Another important aspect is the way silent work trains your myelin pathways. Myelin is the insulation around neural fibers that allows signals to travel faster and more efficiently. Repetitive, high-quality practice increases myelination, which is crucial for mastery. But this kind of neural optimization doesn't happen under the spotlight. It happens during solitary effort, when the only observer is your own nervous system. Silence amplifies the feedback loop between your body, brain, and environment. That's where myelin builds. That's where expertise is coded. In essence, recognition is fleeting and often out of your control, but repetition is within your grasp every day. Working hard in silence doesn't just build discipline. It allows the brain to rewire at the deepest level. It shifts your identity not through affirmation, but through architecture. You become the kind of person who does the work, regardless of who's watching. And that identity, formed through neuroplastic repetition, becomes unshakable. You no longer rely on external cues to keep moving forward. The act of doing again and again becomes its own source of momentum. There is a powerful and often overlooked truth in behavioral neuroscience. Talking about your goals can psychologically simulate achievement, reducing the likelihood that you'll actually follow through. This phenomenon, sometimes referred to as social projection, has been studied and verified through multiple psychological and neurobiological studies. When you speak publicly about your plans, your brain releases reward chemicals, particularly dopamine, creating a false sense of completion. This is incredibly dangerous to the process of execution especially in 2025, where public declarations have become a form of social currency. The brain operates through feedback loops. When you tell people what you're going to do, whether it's starting a business, losing weight, writing a book, or transforming your life, you trigger a premature reward loop. The social validation, the likes, the praise, the encouragement, all produce a surge of dopamine. This reward system is evolutionarily designed to reinforce behavior. But in this case, it reinforces the wrong thing, talking, not doing. The brain interprets this social approval as evidence that you've already made progress, even though nothing has changed in the physical world. It gives you the neurological payoff without the necessary work, which leads to a drop in motivation when it's time to execute. Working in silence eliminates this pitfall. When you withhold your intentions from public view, your brain retains the motivational tension needed to act. This is known in neuroscience as goal tension, a state where your nervous system stays slightly on edge, mobilizing energy to close the gap between where you are and where you want to be. Publicizing your goals can prematurely release that tension, draining the drive needed to take real action. Silence, on the other hand, preserves it. You keep the energy bottled up, and that pressure fuels deep, consistent execution. There's also a social comparison element to consider. In a hyper-connected world, every declaration invites feedback, commentary, and judgment. Whether positive or negative, that input begins to distort your internal compass. You start adjusting your pace, your goals, even your identity based on how others perceive your journey. This social distortion fractures focus. You're no longer executing based on your internal values and vision. You're reacting to an external narrative. Over time, that erodes self-trust, and without self-trust, execution becomes fragile. Working in silence shields your intent from these social contaminants. It preserves the purity of your process, which is vital for long-term clarity and discipline. Moreover, the part of the brain responsible for high-level thinking and decision-making, the prefrontal cortex, functions best when it operates with autonomy and minimal distraction. Constant social projection hijacks this region by introducing unnecessary complexity, such as managing your image, adjusting for opinions, or defending your direction. This causes cognitive fatigue and reduces working memory, making it harder to sustain effort or follow through on long-term plans. Silent work is not just emotionally intelligent, it is cognitively protective. It gives your prefrontal cortex room to plan, prioritize, and persist without the burden of external noise. The psychology of momentum also plays a key role. Real momentum is built on action, not announcement. Every small task completed, every hour invested, every disciplined choice made in private contributes to an internal momentum loop. Your brain begins to associate effort with self-respect, progress with integrity. The silence becomes a training ground for identity shift. You don't become a writer by telling the world you're going to write a book. You become a writer by writing every day when no one's watching. That behavioral repetition, reinforced through silent execution, begins to rewire your self-image and identity at the neural level. In 2025, when nearly every move is broadcasted and curated for attention, the person who chooses strategic silence builds something different. They're not looking for applause. They're building leverage. They're preserving energy that others waste on performance. They are accumulating silent victories, compound habits, and undisturbed progress. They know that delayed recognition strengthens resilience. They understand that every minute spent talking about a plan could have been used to refine it. They train their nervous system to crave execution, not expression. And that makes their work deeper, their direction sharper, and their outcomes far more powerful over time. Silence becomes their shield, their amplifier, their edge. One of the most powerful transformations a human being can experience is a shift in identity, not through external success, but through the alignment of clear vision and deliberate action. Neuroscience confirms that identity is not fixed. It's plastic, adaptable, and shaped by behavior over time. The combination of sustained vision and repeated execution rewires the brain circuitry and reshapes self-perception. In 2025, where image often overshadows substance, the most effective individuals are those who quietly integrate their vision into consistent, uncelebrated action. This silent repetition is what creates lasting identity change at a biological level. The brain doesn't change because of what you say you want to become. It changes because of what you consistently do. Every time you take action aligned with your vision, you create micro confirmations within your neural networks. These confirmations are signals that say, this is who I am becoming. The more frequently you perform the behavior, the stronger the neural pathway becomes, and the more congruent your actions and self-concept grow. Vision without action remains fantasy. Action without vision lacks direction. But when the two merge, they generate internal momentum strong enough to override fear, fatigue, and doubt. Inside the brain, this transformation is guided by a principle known as self-directed neuroplasticity. It's the process by which you can consciously rewire your brain by directing your attention and behavior towards specific outcomes. Vision is the blueprint. It orients your prefrontal cortex toward a long-term target. Action is the tool that activates the motor cortex and limbic system to build the behavioral patterns needed to reach that target. Together, they synchronize intention and execution, forging a new version of you, not through what you declare, but through what you demonstrate repeatedly in silence. One of the biggest mistakes people make is waiting until they feel like the person they want to become before taking action. But the science is clear: action precedes identity. Your brain doesn't wait for permission. It waits for proof. Each silent decision to wake up early, to train, to write, to learn sends proof to your brain that you're changing. These actions trigger the release of neurotransmitters like dopamine and acetylcholine, which play critical roles in reinforcing motivation and attention. The more your actions align with your internal vision, the faster your brain adapts to your new identity. Silence is a critical part of this transformation. In silence, there's no need to perform, impress, or explain. The only feedback loop is between your behavior and your biology. You start to see yourself differently, not because of how others react, but because of how consistently you've acted in accordance with your values and vision. That an internal shift is far more powerful than external validation because it's grounded in neurological evidence. It's encoded into the structure of your brain, into the depth of your routines, and into the reflexes that shape your day-to-day life. In 2025, where identity is often externally constructed through bios, profiles, and curated content, the real transformation happens in isolation. It's built in the early hours when no one's awake. It's reinforced during quiet evenings when others are distracted. It's formed not in grand gestures, but in ordinary moments of aligned effort. These moments, repeated over time, sculpt your neural identity, a version of yourself that doesn't rely on external recognition to exist. That is what gives it durability. That is what makes it real. The act of aligning vision and action also engages your default mode networks, DMN, a network in the brain involved in self-reflection, future planning, and autobiographical memory. When you take silent, intentional actions toward your vision, the DMN becomes more organized and efficient. Your brain literally becomes better at connecting past experience with future goals, making you more strategic, more aware, and more grounded in your trajectory. You no longer live on autopilot. You begin to architect your life with precision. This internal alignment generates something even more powerful than motivation, conviction. Motivation can fluctuate based on mood, energy, or environment, but conviction is hardwired. It's what remains when the emotions fade, when the applause never comes, when the path gets difficult. Conviction is built through the repeated experience of acting in alignment with your vision, especially when no one is watching. It's a quiet fire that doesn't need to shout because it's backed by proof. You no longer need to convince others. You've convinced your nervous system. And once that happens, change is no longer a question of possibility. It's a matter of inevitability. In 2025, the digital landscape is saturated with people showcasing curated images of progress, success, and potential. Social media, content platforms, and even professional networks reward impression management. How things appear far more than genuine, behind the scenes input, the raw effort that actually drives transformation. But the brain doesn't rewire from impressions. It doesn't respond to performance. It adapts through input, consistent, focused, deliberate effort that occurs regardless of who's watching. In a world where output is gamified and validated instantly, the people who double down on input, on what they put into their system, will be the ones who win the long game. The nervous system thrives on repetition, rhythm, and reward. When you focus exclusively on output, views, likes, recognition, you become chemically dependent on external stimulation. Each spike of attention triggers a burst of dopamine, but those highs are short-lived, and what follows is a crash that leaves the brain feeling understimulated. Over time, this leads to a dangerous loop: more posting, more projecting, more seeking attention in order to recreate that neurological spike. What gets lost in that cycle is the actual work, the raw input your brain needs to establish neural pathways, build real skills, and make lasting behavioral change. By focusing on input, you reverse this dependency. You begin to train your brain to derive dopamine, not from recognition, but from effort. This is a shift in neurochemistry that has lasting effects. When the brain starts to release dopamine in response to action, writing for an hour, training in silence, learning something new, it becomes self-reinforcing. It builds what's known as dopaminergic resilience, the ability to sustain motivation from within rather than relying on rewards from the outside world. This type of motivation is essential for pushing through the resistance, boredom, and fatigue that inevitably show up during deep work. Input is what drives plasticity. Each moment you practice a skill, push your body, or deepen your understanding, you're feeding your brain the raw material it needs to adapt. Neurons respond to intensity and frequency of effort, not to how good your journey looks online. In fact, the more silent your input, the more stable your transformation becomes. That's because it's protected from noise, comparison, and unnecessary self-consciousness. It remains internal, precise, and undisturbed. That's the environment where elite performance is forged, away from eyes, insulated from trends, grounded in process. 2025 has increased both the speed and pressure of visibility. People are expected to show progress constantly, to brand their hustle, share their goals, and document every step. But that cycle produces shallow effort. When you're focused on appearing productive, you compromise depth. You begin to optimize for what's shareable, not what's sustainable. Silent, high-quality input does the opposite. It prioritizes learning curves, long-term thinking, and genuine growth. And because it happens in isolation, it allows you to take risks, make mistakes, and stretch beyond your comfort zone without fear of embarrassment or judgment. That flexibility accelerates learning and builds real capability. This input-first approach also trains your executive functions, the part of your brain responsible for planning, impulse control, and goal execution. These circuits are not activated when you talk about your goals. They're activated when you break a sweat, sit in the discomfort of effort, and push past mental resistance. Each time you choose input over impression, you strengthen these neural systems, making you more adaptable, focused, and capable of handling future complexity. Your brain becomes a tool of production, not performance. Silent input compounds. The gains are not immediately visible, and that's why most people abandon them. But those who persist quietly experience something profound: exponential growth. They work on their body, and it starts to respond. They study in silence, and their thinking sharpens. They build projects in solitude, and one day they're miles ahead. That's not luck. That's accumulation. And the reason it works is because it's invisible long enough to escape the distortions of comparison and expectation. That invisibility gives your effort time to mature into mastery. There's a concept in neuroscience called synaptic potentiation, which refers to the strengthening of connections between neurons through repeated activation. This is how habits, reflexes, and expertise are formed. But this strengthening only occurs when circuits are activated consistently. Not when they're announced, but when they're exercised. Input is the activation. Silence is the safeguard. Together, they create a force multiplier. You no longer need